So in addition to the generous support from Dr. Moriarty, I want to extend our thanks to the Office of the Provost and at the University of Pittsburgh and the Year of the Humanities Initiative, as well as the University Library System, the Dietrich School's Department of Biological Sciences, the Humanities Center, and of course our host, our site this evening, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. So thanks for having us this evening. And with us tonight, we have Barbara Weissberger from the Studio Arts Department at the University of Pittsburgh. We have Kirk Savage from the History of Art and Architecture Department at Pitt also. And we have Rich Pell from CMU and the Center for PostNatural History, and Steve Tonsor on the end from the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. And as I was thinking about how to introduce tonight's discussion, I was thinking a lot about my daughter and how she experiences curiosity. She's 4 years old, and so she has a lot of questions, and she's very verbal in how she describes things, right, and how she observes the world around her. And so say she's, tromping through a puddle, and she's noticing the ripples that her boots make, okay? And then she likes to talk about all these things that she's noticing. And then she also is talking about the reflections from the trees, the bare trees above her, and how those reflections are getting bent by the ripples, okay? And so the adults in her life have a number of different ways of responding to this. And some adults will sort of comment on, oh, she's such a scientific thinker. She really thinks like a scientist. And then there are other adults in her life who say, wow, she really has the eye of an artist. She's really artistic. And it's the same behavior that they're noticing. And I think that that's really interesting. And so I offer that story to get us started for a couple of reasons. One is that I think it sort of grounds this discussion of sites, and it makes it, it gives us a chance to talk about the abstract as well as the really tangible thing that happens when we engage with a site, okay? And that is our question this evening: how do sites cultivate curiosity? And then the other reason I thought that story would be an appropriate way to get started is that I think it can be a point of connection among artists and scientists and all of us in how we express our own experiences of curiosity and awe and the desire to explore. So a couple of things before I turn it over, a couple of practical things this evening. We are being recorded, so we welcome your questions throughout the discussion. And in order to capture your questions, we'll need you to speak into a microphone, okay? And we have 4 undergraduate curiosity interns. Can you guys wave? Okay. And who's the one with the mic tonight? Okay, over there. And so just let them know if you'd like to ask a question, and they'll come over. You also probably see some paper being passed around. And if you would be more comfortable writing your question down, please do that and just sort of wave the paper, and one of the interns will come over and grab it. The other job that they have after this event is to write responses to this evening's discussion, and those will be available on the Frick Fine Arts Library blog, and so we'll make sure we send that link to everyone when it's live. And our interns are 2 humanities students and 2 students from biological sciences, and they're working in pairs this evening. So, and without further ado, I think we'll get going. Each of our panelists deal with sites in very specific ways, site-specific ways, if you will. And so if you could each introduce yourself and then tell us about what resonates with you with the topic tonight.
You're looking at me?
Yes, so you'll need your mic there. Yeah, I don't think it's on yet. Yeah. There we go.
Technology.
Yes. So Barbara Weissberger.
So I'm very excited that you invited me to participate in this panel that has to do with sites, because it is something I think about a lot with regard to my artwork. Perhaps mostly with my life as an artist as opposed to my life teaching at Pitt. But the most obvious strong connection that I have with the idea of sites and curiosity, and the first thing that really comes to mind for me, is my studio. And I'm an artist who who does work that's referred to as studio practice, meaning the work that I make is very much centered on what happens in the studio. And so that is obviously a site of a lot of curiosity, and frustration and all kinds of things, but that's really a site for curiosity. And the other thing I was thinking about, your invitation dovetailed with a shift in the way that I was thinking about my work with regard to sites, and that is I do a lot of artist residencies. So I do a lot of my work in studios that are not mine, but at art residencies, which are institutions which award time and space to artists. They provide a studio and a place to live so that an artist can work sort of off-site in another studio, completely devoted to whatever their project is. And so I do that. I do a lot of that every year. I work in artist residencies. And so, and the work that I do, I make installations, temporary installations that I photograph, and the photographs are the works. So for a long time, I was thinking that I was very lucky because the way that I work, the work that I'm doing now, is very portable. So it's very conducive to having a very peripatetic life and traveling and doing these artist residencies and making the work in all kinds of studios that are alien to me in some way. And so I thought, that's great. I'm making work that really allows me to do this. And then a little bit before you invited me to participate in this, I started thinking that maybe the inverse was true, and that maybe traveling a lot, and I like to travel light, so I like to go to these places with a kind of limited amount of materials and tools, and that maybe traveling a lot and working in strange studios that were not my sites, maybe that had actually given rise to the work that I was doing. So moving around a lot and not being so rooted, maybe that had kind of sparked the work that I was doing. So it was a really great confluence when you invited me, and I had just been thinking about how these temporary sites were influencing my work. And then I was also thinking about, in that situation, you're something of a traveler. And the writer Rebecca Solnit talks about how when we travel, to some extent, we're sort of free of ourselves. And so I was thinking a lot about working in various studios that were not my own, and how I was somewhat of an outsider in that situation, or a traveler, and thinking that, I think there is something about that maybe really fosters curiosity in a particular way, because you're sort of out of your usual groove, and maybe it fosters alertness or a kind of presence that you need when you're making art, which is actually something that came up in the first conversation, talking about presence as it relates to curiosity. So that's how I
great.
Connected with that.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, Kirk Savage.
Hi, I'm Kirk, and I'm an art historian, and so like most art historians, we're very interested in sites, and particularly most art historians spend a lot of time in art museums. That would be the sort of key site that they are. And I love art museums. I love museums in general. But I actually don't work on, typically my career has not been built on working on objects that are inside museums. I've been working for 25, 30 years on art that's outside in the public domain, and especially public monuments. And many of them public monuments that people don't pay any attention to. So these are overlooked sites that have long since ceased to provoke any curiosity whatsoever. And so for me, one of the things that I'm really interested in is I'm interested in the way in the overlooked, in sites that are overlooked and forgotten in in our lives that could be actually very much near us in our day-to-day life, but we don't even know that they're there. And they, for me, really spark my excitement and curiosity because I can see how I can make them legitimate, avenues of inquiry for the kind of work, interest in how history is made and the traces of the past and the present and all that kind of, those sorts of things. So, I think that as human beings, we can't afford to be curious about everything in our environment. We wouldn't be functional if we were equally curious about every point in the environment that we encounter. We have to get from point A to point B. We have a meeting, we have to get there. We have to do all kinds of things in order to function that mean that we have to filter out most of the stimuli that we actually get from the outside world. So, one of the things that so interests me is trying to go back and is selecting things that have been, that are normally not selected for attention by most people, and then asking, seeing what questions those provoke just by observing and looking at them closely, and maybe asking certain questions about them or following their lead. What kinds of questions do they pose to me by looking at them very closely? I'll just give you one anecdote about that because one thing that I like to do, it's kind of almost like a parlor game now with me, but I'll put up for my students in the auditorium, let's say, it's been a while since I've taught in the auditorium, but I used to teach to say 100 people in the auditorium, an introductory course on American art. And one of the things that I would do sort of early on in the course is I'd put up a slide. And back in the day, it was actually a physical slide of of the monument that is literally right outside the door of our building. It's called the Hiker. It's a Spanish-American War Memorial. It's out by the side entrance, which is now the disability accessible entrance to the Frick Fine Arts building. And the first time I did this, I had 100 people in the room, and not a single person could identify it. Have any of you ever seen this? No, never seen it before. They've gone by it hundreds of times, and then so we go out and we actually troop out of the building and we go and look at it, and it turns out there's a whole history of imperialism and Philippines and soldiers and war and masculinity, all this kind of stuff that once you start looking at it, and it's a site that's right there. We don't have to go traveling to Europe. We don't have to go, it is right literally just yards away from where we're sitting. So that's what is really, that hits my sweet spot, is that kind of curiosity.
My name is Rich Pell, and I run a small museum here in Pittsburgh called the Center for PostNatural History, which I operate with my partner Lauren Allen, who's somewhere in those bright lights. And we're dedicated to living things that have been intentionally altered by people. That's what we mean by post-natural history, because they're the things that tend to not be in museums like this one. So we sort of start with domestication and go forward to genetic engineering, synthetic biology, this sort of thing. But we very much consider ourselves a place that is dedicated to cultivating curiosity. It's like practically in our mission statement. And one of the things that occurred to me as I was trying to think through like what exactly that means is that I sometimes use that interchangeably with wonder. Like we talk about cultivating a sense of wonder. And I also talk about cultivating curiosity. And I think they were almost synonymous in my head. And then I kind of dug into it, and they couldn't be more different. So I'm going to share with you how I split the space between wonder and curiosity, because that sort of is how I'm defining curiosity as I'm talking about it here. But wonder is like this, wonder has this long history. Religion is very interested in wonder in the sense that is linked to awe. The architecture that's associated with the religions is all about that experience of wonder, humility. It inspires devotion, sacrifice. A lot of different things can come out of that sense of wonder. And sometimes curiosity is one of them, but it doesn't have to be. Curiosity, rather, is kind of linked to, it has a meddlesome history. People have been really kind of a little fearful of curiosity in the past. Italian iconographer named Cesare Ripa said that curiosity is the unbridled desire of those who seek to know more than they should. That was in 1593. When I think of wonder, like wonder is perfectly happy to like visit the land of Oz and behold the great and powerful Oz. But it's curiosity that goes and peeks behind the curtain. I link it with skepticism. I link it with really the scientific method itself. At some point it starts with a curious impulse that you create a hypothesis about. Curiosity is willing to risk disappointment, right? You get an answer that wasn't as good as you had hoped. It's willing to risk embarrassment. That was a dumb question, right? It's willing to risk prosecution sometimes. Why is this door open? Or even injury and death. Curiosity killed the cat after all. Curiosity is inherently a threat to sort of the status quo, kind of whatever is normal right now. The status quo is always saying, well, this is how it is. And curiosity is always asking why. So that's where I'm coming from.
Take this one. Thanks. Museums really only exist because of curiosity. There would be nobody coming through the doors if people weren't curious. People come into museums because they are rewarded in seeing the familiar in new places. So learning that other organisms share identity with us. They're also rewarded by seeing unexpected in the familiar. We are, in a museum, we are an archive. In this particular museum, we're an archive of life and of the history of the earth. I've been reading a work by a fellow named Jacques Derrida, which is about archives and the meaning of archiving. And it's closely tied up with the archivists. We present the archives with an interpretation, a kind of a dogma or orthodoxy, right? And curiosity, as Rich alluded, is a threat to that. And part of our role in museums is actually to present this, but also to present the opportunity to question what you think you know, to question whether the familiar is something you've really seen and understood. And I think this is what Kirk is talking about with a monument that you walk by every day and have never questioned, because you have a worldview that doesn't incorporate it. Yet it's right there in front of your face. And part of our job in a museum is to confront you with the familiar, but in unfamiliar ways, and get you to question what you know and why you know it. And at the same time, that is something that is in a way threatening to the culture. So it's a delicate place to be for a museum. And I think it's worth thinking also about who is coming in and being curious. And this is echoing what you were saying earlier about expressing curiosity in unfamiliar places. When you go to a new place, you're not bound by the orthodoxy in the same way because you don't know what it is. And you see that monument and you assume that it's important and you look at it. And you also question the curious behavior of the natives, right? Likewise, if you look around the museum, it's not a cross-section of our culture that attends. And those people who are in certain segments of our culture who come into the museum find themselves asking different kinds of questions and curious in different ways because they're not as familiar with the orthodoxy. And it's those questions in particular that are, in a way, the most threatening, but the most important in coming to a common culture among all of us. In this table, we have a kind of a gradient from sort of more pure art to maybe more pure science. And I think it's interesting to consider, again, what was said about the studio as a site of pursuing curiosity, and also the laboratory as a site for pursuing curiosity. Those are both places where we use material practices in exploring ideas, in pursuing our curiosity. They use somewhat different methods, and they're best at somewhat different things. I would argue that art is better at raising the questions, at confronting you with the things that really don't fit what you think you know, and science is perhaps a little better at finding solutions and finding at least apparent answers in the process. So that's what I have to say.
So do any of you have questions for one another, or do we have questions from the audience? Yes.
I'd like to.
Can we get a microphone over? Thanks.
My question about curiosity is, do you think it is an aptitude that some people have more than others? Or do you think it's a behavior that we nurture and reinforce, and that we all start with the same amount of curiosity, if you will?
What do we think, folks? Who wants to take that?
You look like you're poised.
Let's have
I'm
it.
happy to take
Yeah.
I don't know about a genetic basis for curiosity. I think it is something that is, you get it from your surroundings. So it is something that can be cultivated, but it's complicated how it arrives at us. And one kind of important aspect of this is that I think there may be more cultural forces invested in squelching it than there are in cultivating it. Everything from just kind of the peer pressure of like not wanting to stick out in the crowd, not wanting to raise your hand, not wanting to feel dumb in front of other people, all that kind of stuff, way deep-seated from when you're a little kid, all the way up through to having an extremely regimented time schedule. Curiosity takes time, and it doesn't take 20 minutes a day. It takes a lot of time. So those kinds of factors are things that I think about in terms of like a place of curiosity is almost like you're defending against these other forces that are kind of encroaching in and kind of make it harder to be in that place of curiosity.
I thought immediately with that of my daughter when she was about 3 years old, and we had hired a woman to take care of her during the day who was a really loving woman and taught my daughter a lot. I can remember, and she was a very deeply religious woman, and I remember coming into the dining room of our 1883 farmhouse at that time, and they were standing by the window, and my daughter was looking out the window, and she said to Nancy, "Why do the clouds move?" And Nancy said to her, "God moves them." And there's nothing wrong with that answer, but it is possible to ask how that works, right? And so, there is a kind of a suppression of curiosity by giving too simple an answer. And it isn't that the answer is wrong, but there are opportunities to invite people to explore more fully. And I think that's both what universities do and what museums do. I think for a lot of kids, the education they get in primary and secondary school is an education of those sort of simpler, more comfortable explanations in a way. If they're lucky, they get challenged during that time. For a lot of kids, that doesn't happen. And at the time when they reach university, or when they go to places like museums, that's a time when they're invited to continue to ask questions and to be rewarded for doing that. And because this particular Curiosity Forum is about how organizations and institutions can cultivate curiosity, I think it's really important to think about how we reward kids in light of what Rich was just saying, and kind of counteract the pressure to just sort of take the simple explanation, not be a tall poppy, as they say in the Netherlands, and
I
help
think-
them to continue to be curious.
And continuing on that, I think that there needs to be a willingness to say, I don't know, but let's find out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's, I think that parents and teachers sort of put pressure on themselves to have an answer, and when they don't, they sort of make it go away, or it's tempting to make it go away.
That also then creates the illusion for the child that somehow they're going to make the transition to knowing everything, right? And that sets up a kind of a self-deprecation on their part, which is really bad for them, right?
So this speaks a little bit to what you were saying about access, and since we know education is not equally fantastic for all children, and also, curiosity and play are really bound up together. So all kids in playing, in play acting, and it's very deeply linked. Which is something that everyone has access to. And this also makes me think about the way, up to a certain age, kids are really, I think, pretty generally encouraged to draw. And then at a certain age, that somehow has to get shut off. That's not serious. And that kind of, and some of us like to think of drawing as a way of thinking and as a way of being curious. And so that gets kind of shut down at some point. For, I don't know, it's like a time thing, there are other more important things that you have to learn and have to achieve.
Do we have any other questions? I can't really see hands in the light, so you have to.
we feel sort of like we're in the Spanish
So whoever has
Inquisition.
the microphone, if you could sort of look to see, yes, there we go. Okay.
Well, I was very interested in your movement toward educating youngsters, and I'd like your comment on this. That's why I'm raising the question. It seems to me that a very important one word related to curiosity is the word why. It seems to me that we should encourage our kids, whether they're our own or in classrooms or whatever, to always ask the question why, and to lead them on, if it takes that, to a question, why is this coming to me over TV? What does this person want me to do, and why does he want me to do it? Why does the puddle look the way it does when I stomp through it as a 4-year-old? Why do I get the reflections? It seems to me it's so important that we help children and youngsters to always ask the why question and to apply critical thinking to the answers. And to me, that's bound up in curiosity, and I'd like your comments.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond?
I completely agree with your remarks there. And one of the things, this was an issue that came up a lot in our first session as well. And obviously this is going to be, I think, a continuing theme is how the educational system does or does not encourage curiosity in learners in general. And so part of the problem, I've been teaching a long time. People around this table have been, teaching. There's a lot of teaching experience at this table. And one of the things that happens with asking questions, I think one of the ways in which we fundamentally often go wrong in the classroom is that when we ask questions, we're looking for particular answers. And that absolutely destroys curiosity, I think. So often you'll see, and this is, I would say, the typical experience of students in classrooms. When a question is asked, they're trying to figure out what the teacher wants them to say. What answer does the teacher have in mind? The game is not truly an open-ended why question. The game for the student is to figure out what the teacher has in mind as the answer. And so that's really deadening to the process of really inquiry and curiosity. So I think there's a way in which sites, one of the things that excited me about this panel is that I have found in my own teaching, it's almost impossible to get out of that dynamic with students. It's very difficult. You have to work very hard at getting out of that dynamic with students. And one of the ways that I do it is to get physically out of the classroom, to leave the classroom, where then a whole different set of rules seems to drop away. All, like the behaviors, the familiar behaviors of the classroom go away, and we go to a site and we look at a monument, and then it's all of a sudden like they're free.
This is what you were saying.
They're free to, and I think this is a big thing with studio art education too. Some people seek out studio art education because there is no answer the teacher is looking for there,
You still get it.
yeah. Anyway.
I agree as well. I think why is like the most powerful question in the world. But I think curiosity is all about is about asking questions. But the power of it, the trick, is that you, in order for you to care, and I think caring is actually also a part of being curious, you have to kind of own the question. Like it has to be your question. It can't be handed to you on a piece of paper and then you're suddenly curious about that. You have to at least identify with it in some way. And I think that's the trick. That's the trick in teaching. It's the trick in museums and places. If we want to be cultivating curiosity, is how to get people to arrive at their own questions that are really their own, and not to answer them, but let them leave with them. And in that moment, you're actually starting to teach yourself. Like once you kind of want to know something that you don't already know, and you know the rough outlines of it, then you can learn something that you won't forget because you wanted to know it to begin with, which is the hard part in teaching.
Yeah, I think it's also like when you're teaching, you're giving students information, and you sort of have to. And the trick of that, I think, is sort of when to stop. Sort of like take them to the site, give enough. I was thinking when you were saying that, another trick is sort of bringing someone in from outside. But it's all this kind of like, sort of like finding the experience that allows the students room to come up with their own questions. Because I agree that if it's not your question, then you're not that invested in it.
So the traditional model of teaching has been a model that we developed really in the Middle Ages, when access to knowledge was quite limited. And the role of the professor originally was to stand up and deliver that knowledge. We're in a time now when people can access knowledge on their own to a large extent, and I think our role as teachers, as people in museums is, as everybody's been saying, to encourage people to ask the questions. But I would say it's fine for them to leave with those questions, but we want them to leave with an increased understanding of how to explore the questions as well. I think that's really become, and maybe always was, fundamentally the role of the teacher, the docent, the curator in putting together an exhibition, is both to provoke the situation in which they ask the questions, their own questions, and then to give them avenues for continuing to pursue that. I think that's particularly important. Well, I don't know, maybe it's important for everybody, but it's certainly important for kids, so that they don't just have one moment of curiosity and aha, but have a way to continue to live that kind of life.
And I would add that librarians are also on that list of
Yeah,
people
certainly.
that can help them develop the tools
Yeah.
for pursuing those questions.